My address this morning is really related to a good number of addresses I've given here in the last year or so, and it's really born out of my disturbed desire to try to understand this moment of craziness in American culture, craziness and danger politically, in terms of questions of the erosion of truth and reason and facts and all those things that are really the mainstays of ethical culture. We, more than other people, should be upset, if not frightened, about what's going on in America. So this is another effort to try to understand the craziness of the moment. Not that there always hasn't been from the beginning strong threads of unreason in American life, but it seems to me that what we're going through now has undercurrents and dynamics that make it distinctive and distinctively troubling. Central to ethical culture is the absence of a creed, at least in the traditional religious sense. But ethical culture clearly holds to certain principles and values that help to define us. Primary is a respect for the dignity of all people, but also very important to ethical culture is a commitment to reason and a commitment to the well-being of others. Commensurate with our humanism is putting a premium on rational thought and a belief in science as the best way to enhance human knowledge. We assume that the beliefs we hold should be based on evidence and facts rather than wishful thinking. And ethical culture, I would say, values a life lived with honesty, integrity, and a devotion to being truthful and seeking out the truth to the extent that the truth can be known to us. Politically speaking, since its founding in 1876, ethical culture has promoted democracy as the best form of government. These values emanate from our focal commitment to human dignity, because one might conclude that there is not much dignity in a life that is not rooted in a respect for honesty, truthfulness, the edifying and uplifting value of searching for truth, and employing facts, evidence, and reason to help get us there. Beyond enhancing appreciation for the dignity of all, we might conclude that these values, including democratic participation, are the best foundations to enable human flourishing, which is also a defining goal of ethical culture. Ethical culture aims at creating a rich life for you, for me, for everyone, guided by these values. Given that we prize these values, and for many of us we have tried to build our lives around them, the current climate we are in must be particularly upsetting. And beyond that, our times, I conclude, threaten what we hold most dear, and perhaps even our own sense of security. I know it does for me when I survey our political situation, and I contemplate the future of American society, the global community, and beyond that, yes, the fate of our planet. However volatile American society has been in my lifetime, I think of urban riots, assassinations of political leaders, the protests against the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights era, and the ongoing racial oppressions which remain endemic in American society. However great the factionalism and even hatred in America has been, I cannot personally recall a time when the most fundamental basic underpinnings of society, indeed any society, have been so challenged by so many, when reason, science, the authority of facts, and what is essentially true has been so frontally dismissed, ignored, and attacked. And we are bombarded with this on the news 24/7. As many have noted, we live in a so-called post-truth, post-fact age. It feels as if reality has lost its moorings, society has fallen down a rabbit hole, and I would argue that no society can endure for long unless certain baseline realities and public facts are held in common. Of course, Donald Trump, ostensibly the world's most powerful man, is the primary purveyor of this post-truth, post-fact phenomenon. It has become a parlor game among the media and pundits to count the number of lies Donald Trump has perpetrated. Michiko Kakutani, the former book review editor for the New York Times, in her recent book volume, The Death of Truth, which I read last year, counted 2,140 lies in Trump's first year in office alone. Not only is global warming a Chinese hoax, but he recently, as you may have read, has claimed that the noise from wind turbines causes cancer. We've come to expect this, and the time is long past when we are shocked by Trump's lies. He lies as he breathes. And Trump assaults the truth, not only by flat-footed lies, but also by creating an aura of ambiguity with such phrases as I've heard people say, or some say, or many say, that he often invokes. Being truthful or not is not the issue for Donald Trump. His bold-faced lying is rather, I believe, an assertion for power. Quote, I can say what I please, and the truth and facts be damned, end quote, might well be his motto. But Trump arguably is not the prevailing cause of the post-truth phenomenon. He is emblematic of a much broader, deeper, and older phenomenon that will still be with us once he departs from the scene. The fact that the entire Republican Party has fallen prey to his mendacity, and what is most galling, the leadership of the party refused to stand up to it, and his base seems not to care, bespeaks a much wider phenomenon than just the derangement of one individual, however powerful he may be. The fact that so many don't care is what I find most upsetting and frightening. Trump represents an especially extreme example, but a case can be made, and has been made, that ambiguity about truth, in fact, is endemic to the nature of democracy, and that's what I want to talk about. In other words, democracy and truth don't fit so tightly well together, and the problems we are experiencing now actually have very long-standing roots in the way in which democracy has evolved and the way in which it functions. By its very nature, democracy has always had and will have a problem with truth. This premise is laid out in a new book by a University of Pennsylvania professor, historian of ideas by the name of Sophia Rosenfeld. The book is entitled Democracy and Truth. In this short book, Professor Rosenfeld concludes that if we take a long look into history, the assault on truth may have its roots in the nature of democracy itself. She goes on to elaborate in great detail why the process of democracy has always created a relationship to truth that is fragile and very contested. But she does agree and conclude that there are ominous dimensions to the current post-truth phenomenon we witness that are unique to our times, very distressing and dangerous, and need to be addressed and confronted. What is new is the depth to which truth is assaulted in our democracy. In her view, there are two types of truths. The first type is based on logic and on solid facts. It is simply true that it is either raining or not raining, or it is a fact that the New York Ethical Society is located on Central Park West. More significantly, it is a fact that evolution and natural selection is a correct way to describe the emergence of species, or that global warming is taking place and human agency plays a role in it. These are one kind of truth that make reference to facts that are reasonably objective. But there are other truths that are not so clear and are more subject to interpretation. For example, I'll give you one example. Experts in official Washington or the news media tell us as a fact that the economy right now, our economy is doing very well, and this is repeated over and over and over again. Okay? In defense of this fact, they make the assertion that unemployment is now 3.6%, the lowest it's been since 1969. Okay? But what is central to Rosenfeld's analysis is whose facts are these really? Okay? In other words, who controls and promotes the facts? That question is key in a democracy. The fact that the unemployment rate is 3.6% may in fact be true. But what it masks is the deeper reality that many people have stopped looking for work and have dropped out of the labor force altogether. From the official point of view, such a low unemployment rate should be a source of happiness. But if you look beneath the surface of all those employed Americans and ask yourself, what is the nature of their employment as they experience it, you might come away with different conclusions. Yes, many people are employed now who were not employed 3 years ago. But at the same time, their felt experience in their work situation may be one of high anxiety. It's noted that more than 40% of all Americans have fewer than $400 in savings, which means that they are only one medical episode or car breakdown from financial panic. More Americans may be employed, but vast numbers are working in crappy jobs that are subcontracted for minimal wages, with no security, no benefits, no vacations, with minimal opportunities for advancement, and I would guess with minimal respect. The experts far away in Washington may pronounce a low employment rate, but people on the ground experience the nature of their employment in such a way that they may come away with different conclusions as to where the truth really lies. The reality may even raise the question of what counts as work. It's a fact, quote unquote, that is open to interpretation depending on where you stand. This is one example relating to the truth of the American economy that raises the question of who determines what is true or not, and opens the door to Rosenfeld's thesis about the nature of truth and democracy. It's an interesting thesis, and in brief, it goes as follows. 400 years ago, when Europe was ruled by monarchs and the church. The truth was in the hands of the rulers, and it served the power interests of the rulers to keep the truth away from people who were uneducated, ruled by their passions, and not to be trusted. There were the rulers and the ruled, and rulers were committed to maintaining their power by maintaining secrets, being untransparent, and through deception. Then the Enlightenment came along and instituted a set of new revolutionary values. The Enlightenment challenged established churches and the rulers. The philosophers of the Enlightenment maintained, according to Roosevelt, that no single individual or institution should, quote, hold a monopoly on determining what counts as truth in public life, end quote. The Enlightenment thinkers put a premium on the values of openness, transparency, sincerity, freedom of expression, and unfettered debate. But this was an ideal, and in no sense was the Enlightenment egalitarian. Many of the Enlightenment's most influential thinkers had little but contempt for uneducated people and wanted to restrict the pursuit of knowledge to a learned elite. This division played a role in how our constitutions of the 18th century were structured. The American founding fathers did not create the United States as a democracy that would give an equal say to all, but rather as a republic, which, in the words of James Madison, the main author of our Constitution, would be ruled, quote, by men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of society, end quote. Jefferson often spoke of that small segment of America that was fit to lead, and he referred to it as, quote, a natural aristocracy, end quote. And it's instructive to remember that the founders allowed for the direct election of the people, for the direct election by the people of only one half of one branch of the three branches of government, that is the House of Representatives. The Senate would follow more than 100 years after that. The very structures of government led to a separation of society into two types of people, the ruling elites and what we might call ordinary folks, ordinary people. This division in the 19th century morphed into the rise of the expert, As societies have become much more complex, they have become far more dependent on experts who possess specialized knowledge, among them economists, statisticians, engineers, architects, lawyers, scientists of various types, and indeed what we'd call technocrats. Society needs these experts who exert a certain type of authority and express their own truths, which is a source of their power. This is where different versions of truth emerge, which she contends is inherent in democracy. In a review of Roosevelt's book in The Nation magazine, a critic by the name of David Bell observes, quote, the authority that experts enjoy can lead them to retreat into a bubble in which they are insulated from public judgment and criticism, and over time they can devolve into a privileged interest group as scornful and condescending towards ordinary people as the most snobbish of the founders, end quote. Just a few examples. As someone who has one foot in academia, I lament the reality that academia and what goes on in the ivory tower indeed is so walled off from society in general and the interests of the common man or the common woman. You know, there used to be a time, and he used to frequent these halls, I think of John Dewey, who was really the icon of what you call the public intellectual, where people in the universities felt an obligation to go out and speak to the general public about what was going on, you know, behind those cloistered, magisterial walls of the university. And there was a tradition in American life of the public intellectual that barely exists anymore. I mean, we don't have, there are some, but that basically doesn't go on very much, okay? I mean, there's the university and its specialized knowledge and its experts over here, and then there's society generally over there. Now, the irony is that parents will pay huge sums, and now we learn will simply bribe college officials to get their kids into top colleges. But I suspect few have any idea what goes on behind college walls, and probably care less as long as their kid gets a diploma as a ticket to the upper echelons of society. I suspect a good number of wealthy parents hold university professors to whom they entrust the education of their children in contempt, given the relatively meager salaries that they earn. But if the wealthy classes see higher education per se in such jaded terms, more to the point that there is a broad-based contempt coming from the less privileged classes of society. A Pew study recently found out, and I find this very distressing, a majority of Republicans, and I'm thinking here primarily of Trump's cohorts, in this regard now say that colleges and university educations, colleges and a university education is now bad for America. I mean, when they go to the doctor, don't they want their doctor to be educated and have a medical degree? I mean, the thinking is just really awry. But a majority of Republicans now say universities and college education is bad for America. It speaks to the divisions. It is, I believe, an expression of contempt for elites, and contempt which marks a major division in our society. Another factor that shows the division between experts and ordinary people is that the knowledge handled by experts has in many cases become abstract, difficult, and abstruse. That is often in a way that is often opaque even to experts in the same fields that do not share a particular subfield. This can readily lead the ordinary person to conclude that the truth put forward by experts is an effort to deceive and pull the wool over the eyes of the common man. But perhaps most corrupting is that while experts are supposed to dispense objective knowledge, their objectivity is perceived and is indeed increasingly compromised. Some think tanks that claim to be doing objective research are in fact very partisan. Many researchers who claim to be independent are dependent on corporate sponsors. And the more expertise is tied to wealthy interests, whether it be medicine, science, academia, the more ordinary people, the common man, are prone to denounce their truths and their facts as a fraud or as an ideological hoax or fake news pushing ahead their own interests. And so we have elites and experts on one side of the divide, and we have on the other side claims made for common sense, and with it the demand that ordinary people participate equally in government. It is Rosenfeld's thesis that democracy by its nature divides the people in this way, which each sector, the experts on the one hand and the common people on the other, each claiming their own version of what is true. Experts make their claims to what is true based on their expertise, and ordinary people rebel against the dispensation of experts in the name of common sense. As Rosenfeld notes, quote, populists tend to reject science and its methods as a source of directives, embracing in many cases emotional honesty, intuition, and the truths of the heart over dry factual veracity and scientific evidence, testing, and credentialing, end quote. Think of Trump claiming knowledge through his gut, appealing to that sensibility of the common man. Think of Trump claiming knowledge through his gut or proclaiming that he loves the undereducated. He is perhaps the first president that holds disdain for his own experts. I mean, this is really quite extraordinary. I mean, his own experts in government are held in disdain. And when I think of this, I'm looking at Monica over there, Trump, of course, doesn't believe in global warming. But one aspect of his government that takes it very seriously is the Pentagon. The Pentagon has its own research bureaus that are looking at global warming. They take it very seriously. Why? Because they realize that the environmental upset caused by global warming has caused and will continue to cause the mass migrations of people. Okay, many of those people flooding into Europe or drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe on these little dinghies from North Africa are coming not because they're fleeing violence necessarily, although many are. They're coming because their lands are no longer sustainable, and they're no longer sustainable because of global warming. Global warming causes mass migrations of people, and when you have mass migrations of people, what you have is political instability. And the Pentagon is very concerned about that. So it's interesting that Trump, the point I'm making here is a dramatic example of how, in effect, he disregards even his, not only expertise, but experts themselves within his own administration, okay? And of course, we know he doesn't read, okay? And through his use of the employment of Twitter and speaking at mass rallies, he can go directly to his audience and bypass the filtering or consultation with any expertise whatsoever. But Trump, I should say, was not the first to do this, first president to take this approach. He's only by far the most malignant expression of it, okay, the most extreme. Ronald Reagan, in fact, if our memories can go back, and everyone in this room, one nice thing about talking to this cohort is, am I right, sir? Everybody, you too? Everybody, in effect, I can speak the same language. It's nice. I don't have to translate things too much, like I do with my undergraduates. I tell them what for them is history, for me is memory, and I have to then sort of interpret. Ronald Reagan was a master at appealing to this approach. As Rosenfeld states, quote, Reagan insisted that he himself was no expert on anything, not even politics. Rather, with his anecdotes and deceptively simple folksy turns of phrases, He also suggests that the kind of expertise associated with lawyers, economists, and other social scientists was unnecessary for determining the principles of governance, end quote. Remember, he was the first one really to promote the idea that government is the enemy of the people. I mean, what could be more suicidal to a democracy than that? And, here we go. Okay. This rebellion against expert opinion can threaten standards of truth in several ways. It leads to a suspicion of expertise in general. It can readily dismiss abstraction and complexity, and it can lead to a conclusion that complex and intractable problems are at bottom really very simple. Trump again exemplifies this contempt for expertise when he claims he knows more about the Middle East than his generals, or banking better than the experts. Or when James Inhofe, who was the former chair of the Senate Environmental Committee, debunked global warming by bringing a snowball into the Senate chambers. I mean, again, reducing complexity to the most basic simplicities. The point of Rosenfeld's thesis is that this division between experts and elites on the one hand, and faith in popular common sense of the common folk on the other, leads to different concepts of the truth and is inherent, in some ways is inherent in the nature of democracy and how it has evolved, leading us to this moment. The experts assert their truth based on research, detailed specialization and knowledge. The common man, what sometimes is referred to as Sarah Palin referred to real Americans, right? The common man, real Americans, the silent majority, and all those other synonyms, who can claim a certain honesty, directness, their conclusions based on intuition, common sense, instinct, and what we might call local knowledge. Scientific evolutionists and paleontologists and biologists may talk about Darwinian evolution, and what you get in response from the hinterland, from the South and the mountain states, is a belief in creationism and a refutation of natural selection, even though it can now be demonstrated in the laboratory, and so on and so forth. And what you get is a type of reaction against elites, it's a good example of that, and a clinging to what you might call local knowledge. And, in some ways, I would argue that the embrace of something like, and the fervent embrace of something like creationism and so on by evangelicals has to do with power structures. They basically have felt abused by East Coast elites who control the national educational curricula or standards, basically own the factories in which they had worked, and so on and so forth, the publishing industries, the dispensation of knowledge. And what you get is a type, given those power inequities, you have a retreat into what I'm referring to as local values. Jesus comes out with mother's milk, It's part of your identity, how you're socialized and how you grow. And people retreat into that parochial stance when indeed they feel they're threatened or oppressed by outside agencies, There's a kind of messy relationship between democracy and truth, she argues, and this is not always, she says, however, not always totally a bad thing. Because on the other hand, to be fair to the facts, experts are often arrogant, and indeed very often they are wrong, and need to be held accountable to challenges which come at times from the people themselves. Democracy and the truths it arrives at are subject to change. And it is the flexibility and the openness, it's democracy's openness to new ideas and new truths that is one of the great strengths of democracy. Democracy in the final analysis is a process and not a set of fixed truths. But what is different and dangerous this time is that the nature of truth in areas where interpretation is possible is now being applied by right-wing populists to dismiss, ignore, undermine, and refute facts and truths about which there cannot and should be no debate. It is one thing to deny the truth that the economy is doing well, and another to assert that vaccines cause autism or that George Soros is paying Islamic terrorists to invade our southern border. The problem with the current moment is that whereas democracy can deal with, and according to Rosenfeld is fated to deal with, the first kind of truth claims, with is the possibility of interpretation, science cannot endure the glib dismissal of facts around which there can be no justifiable debate or matters of interpretation. That the Civil War was fought to end slavery is a fact that is subject to debate. That the temperature of the atmosphere is rising is not. okay? There are different types of truths and so on, and different people will hold them, and democracy, again, is a messy process, and, you know, truth coming from different quarters, whether from elites on the one hand and so forth, and experts, or the common folk on the other, somehow may not totally fit together very neatly. Well, what has caused the assault on truth, that harder type of truth in our times? Rosenfeld assesses two sources, neither of which is surprising. We all, I think, I've spoken about this many times. One is the tremendous power of conservative talk radio and Fox News, if we want to be specific, which not only works to propagandize for the hardline Republicans and to demonize the left, it also comes from their ability to delegitimize mainstream sources of information, which, despite its own biases, still try to make a good faith effort to report facts impartially and objectively. Her second concern is related to social media that turns everyone into a writer, a publisher, and propagandist, which, because of the profusion of voices, quoting from Daniel Bell in The Nation again, quote, drastically lowers the perceived differences between the New York Times, scientific journals, or the federal government on the one hand, and a dyspeptic relative expostulating at his keyboard. In short, the ability of democratic societies to maintain common authoritative sources of truth in the face of reactionary demagogues and media provocateurs has drastically withered, producing vastly destabilizing consequences, end quote. You know, Walter Cronkite being the most trusted man in America, whom I remember well, remember Walter? Right? That may have its dangers because it may have put too much authority in the hands of one person. But I'll tell you, I think we were far better off with Walter behind the microphone and on the 6 o'clock news, 7 o'clock news, than we are today with a profusion of multitudes of voices, many of them promoting bad information and conspiracies. Okay, the internet, among other things, has created a, however much we love it and need it, and the horse ain't going back in the barn, I realize that. The internet, among other things, has created a culture of untruth. Thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill believed that the competition of different ideas would eventually allow the best ideas, the most reasonable ideas, to rise to the top. You know, give everybody a voice, and over time, like a process of intellectual natural selection, that the bad ideas would chase out the good ones, the more rational ones would basically rise to the top. It's a component, I think it's a very nice idea, and it's a component of a humanistic faith, we might say. But in order for this process to take place, there has to be a lot of time. It takes a long time for the process of truth to sort of rise. The internet, we may argue, may subvert that process, because in the briefest time it can send out unedited avalanches of misinformation, which does not allow enough time for deliberation, reflection, mediation, and debate to ensure that the best ideas prevail. Much of the content is devoted to grabbing your attention and not to inspiring a reflection on ideas. Okay. Moreover, a further corrupting of the truth is that a lot of untruths are fomented and underwritten by powerful business interests and have exploited populist resentment, depicting government regulation as elitist, or which denigrates scientific expertise for their own capitalist interests. Think of the Koch brothers or Rupert Murdoch and so on. I mean, it's true that ExxonMobil very early did its own research and came to the conclusion that global warming was a fact. And in fact, they even developed their own oil drilling rigs in such a way to compensate for rising sea levels. And yet they kept that knowledge totally under wraps. They kept it secret from the public, okay? They didn't want to know it. How much, okay, of these hoaxes are fomented by very, very wealthy, okay, corporate interests for their, you know, for their own good. And then they create these crazy bonds between the super wealthy and the common man who is struggling merely to survive. It's an amazing political alliance of our times. So, bringing this to an end, what is to be done in the assault on the most basic truths? Certainly fact-checking is important and necessary, but one could argue that its effects will be limited in that people who are committed to alternative facts are not much interested in the findings of fact checkers. In fact, it's been shown, they've tested this, that if you're arguing with someone who holds a totally irrational, crazy idea, and you put forward the most powerful empirically based evidence, the most powerful rational arguments with that person, you know what you do? You end up not convincing that person, not persuading them to your point of view or opening their minds. You push them back further into their irrationality. I mean, this is one of the most daunting things I think we confront at large in our society. Throw as many facts out there, as you need to, but not much of it sticks. Okay, and that people are impervious. Why? I think because they're driven by much more powerful things, namely the emotions, and the emotions of tribalism, of belonging to groups that hold to similar identical ideologies and feeling the bondedness with those groups, okay? If I'm an evangelical and I belong to a church that espouses creationism, okay, and I have my doubts, I doubt whether I'm going to be chatting in the coffee hour, around the coffee urn, about my commitment to Darwinism. Why? Because I end up socially alienating myself powerfully from the group that gives me my identity, my sense of place, gives me a sense of being at home, and so on and so forth, which all of us crave. By the way, we're tribal too. We don't escape. This is a tribe. All right? No, it's true. I mean, there's no stance of innocence here, right? I mean, we are tribal too. I'd like to believe that our tribe is such that internally it has the mechanism of at least committing itself to be more open to diverse ideas. That's better, okay? But we stick with folks like ourselves who hold to similar ideology and so on and so forth, so beliefs. I mean, that's the way human beings are constituted, and, we've got to work on it. So, fact-checking is important, okay? Now, among other things that she suggests is the need to defend judicial independence and the integrity of our elections, which are under threat, fostering and protecting investigative journalism, and indeed promoting the best of higher education, okay? Those things are not a waste of time. But in my own humble opinion, the most sweeping and necessary way to help restore a broad-based commitment to basic objective truths and get beyond the tribalism and irrationalism so that we can begin to heal the divisions of American society, recognizing that in our democracy there will always be some competition coming from different quarters as to what is true, is to close, I believe, what we've got to do simply is to work at closing the extraordinary wealth gap in American society and restore an economy that allows for upward mobility and therefore hope in a better future. We may have only an unemployment rate of 3.6%, but the reality is that upward mobility has stalled in America. It's stalled. Today, if you are born into poverty, the chances are you will never work your way out of it. It is this stark reality confronting so many Americans, and especially the prospects of their children, that has driven them into the Trump camp, and with it the disdain for facts and for truth. In short, people embrace irrational ideas when reality doesn't work for them anymore, okay? And for too many people in America, reality has ceased to work. But the situation, I believe, is by no means hopeless. While 40% of Americans may embrace Donald Trump and dismiss the claims of facts and truth, at the same time, and I don't want to lionize this year, okay, although I do read it every morning, subscriptions to the New York Times have risen dramatically, okay? Now again, I'm not over making claims of divinity for the New York Times or basically a type of infallibility there, but at least the New York Times does try to commit itself to what you might call objective journalism and so on and so forth. And subscriptions have dramatically gone up. So as much as we have an irrational component or component of American society that's embracing this type of irrationalism, we also have a larger component that has moved, fortunately, in the opposite direction, okay? But, as I'm saying, the Times at least tries to be reality-based. And finally, though ethical platforms need to veer away from being partisan, it is my view that the Democratic Party will remain on the right track as long as it forcefully and intelligently emphasizes basic bread and butter issues. It's got to hammer away at it. Healthcare, enlightened family support policies, a living wage, job security, retirement benefits support for unions, sick leave, job training for a new economy, quality education, and justice and inclusion, okay, racial, ethnic, religious inclusion within an increasingly diverse society. We need to radically revamp the tax structure in this society and create a dramatically greater egalitarian distribution of wealth. We need to strengthen the social safety net through the enactment of powerful federal laws that bring security to all Americans. Now, you may think, a lot of people may think this is a radical idea. Let me just say in closing, and I introduce this to my human rights students when we talk about economic rights. Most people don't know this, but they should. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt gave his last State of the Union address, in which he called for a second Bill of Rights, okay? And in that address, which should be better known, he calls for the creation of 8 economic entitlements that all Americans should basically enjoy. He called for a second Bill of Rights. Now, he was not arguing for, amending the Constitution. That's too difficult, too laborious, too politically dangerous and fraught. What he was calling for, as we have in many European countries, is the instantiation of federal laws that would guarantee things like a minimum wage, guarantee, in effect, housing for everyone, guaranteed, yes, medical care. There are 8 entitlements that he lays out, which would constitute economic rights, economic guarantees that he wanted to see basically encoded into federal legislation. Needless to say, that effort has failed, and we still have to duke out these things politically all the time, and so on. He wanted to make it permanent through federal law and so forth, so it would not be, do you see what I'm saying, changed guarantees? These are ideas that, thank goodness, the Republican Party is beginning to come back to, but they're not new ideas. This was 70 years ago, right? Not so radical. It's not so radical then, and it should not be construed as being so radical now, okay? And when it comes to the great divisions, let me just close with this thought, the great wealth gap in American society, we've had this before. We had it in the era of the robber barons in the late 19th century when ethical culture, out of which ethical culture was born in great measure, to fight the injustices wrought by the Industrial Revolution. And those injustices were met with what was known as the Progressive Era from the 1880s to around World War I. And we did it before. We overcame, those problems and paved the way for the coming of the New Deal. We've done it before, the Progressive Era in the early 20th century, and I believe we can do it again. We need to do it for the sake of justice, and when we do, we will be taking a giant step to preserving our democracy, and yes, to restoring sanity in American life.